Countess Vexillia stood before the quantum glass mirror, her trembling fingers tracing the fine line that had appeared at the corner of her eye, a betrayal of flesh that should not have been possible. For 3 centuries, she had maintained the luminous blue sheen of her skin without a single blemish, her silver-flecked eyes bright with the vitality of youth, despite the ancient knowledge they contained. But now time was catching up. "Jadon," she called, her voice steady despite the panic clawing at her chest. Her most trusted advisor materialized from the shadows of her private chamber, his tall, gaunt form bowing deeply. "My Countess, the treatment is failing." She didn't phrase it as a question. The last specimen was inadequate. Jadon's obsidian eyes revealed nothing. The human expired more quickly than anticipated. The compatibility was not optimal. Vexillia turned away from the mirror, her iridescent robes flowing like liquid starlight around her angular form. "Then find me one who will not expire. Find me one whose essence will last." Her voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "The assemblage of houses meets in 40 solar cycles. I cannot appear before them like this." She gestured to her reflection, where the subtle signs of age, imperceptible to most species but glaring to Astrian eyes, had begun to manifest. The thought of her rivals witnessing her decline sent a cold wave of fear through her ancient heart. "There is a research outpost in the Terran expansion zone," Jadon said carefully. "Our intelligence suggests a geneticist of exceptional skill works there. His genetic profile shows." He paused, selecting his words with precision, promising compatibility markers. Vexillia's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Then bring him to me immediately." Dr. Marcus Quinn squinted at the holographic DNA strand rotating above his workstation, the fatigue of a 16-hour shift making the nucleotide sequences blur before his eyes. Something was wrong with the recombination algorithm, but his exhausted brain couldn't quite pinpoint the error. "Computer, run simulation sequence Delta 9 again," he muttered, reaching for the synthicaf that had gone cold hours ago. The lab around him was silent, his colleagues having departed for their sleeping quarters long ago. Only the soft hum of equipment and the occasional ping of completed analysis broke the quiet of the colony's research facility. Marcus rubbed his eyes. At 34, he was the youngest lead researcher on Proxima Colony, his reputation for solving impossible genetic puzzles having earned him this prestigious but isolating assignment. 3 years into his 5-year contract, and the novelty of living on humanity's furthest outpost had worn painfully thin. The sudden flicker of the overhead lights barely registered in his concentration. Power fluctuations were common on the colony. It was the silence that followed that finally caught his attention. The background hum of environmental systems, the soft whir of his holographic projector, even the faint electromagnetic buzz that was the constant companion of any space colony, all gone. The darkness was absolute. "Computer," his voice echoed strangely in the dead air. "Emergency protocols." A sweet, cloying scent filled his lungs before he could finish the command. Marcus felt his limbs grow heavy, his thoughts slowing to a syrupy crawl. As consciousness slipped away, he had the distinct sensation of being observed, not with human eyes, but something older, colder, and infinitely more patient. Marcus awoke to luxury. Disoriented, he blinked at the unfamiliar ceiling, a dome of what appeared to be living crystal, pulsing with soft, bioluminescent light. The surface beneath him yielded like memory foam but felt organic, warm to the touch and subtly responsive to his movements. "The specimen is conscious," announced a voice like dry leaves rustling. Marcus jerked upright, his scientist's mind cataloging details even as adrenaline flooded his system. The chamber was vast, circular, with walls of the same living crystal as the ceiling. No visible doors. The air carried unfamiliar scents, metallic, sweet, with undertones of something like ozone. And he was not alone. The tall, skeletal figure that had spoken stood near what appeared to be a floating console of light. But it was the other figure, seated on what could only be described as a throne of intertwined, luminous tendrils that commanded his attention. She and Marcus instinctively knew this being was female, was both beautiful and terrifying. Her skin was the deep blue of Earth's oceans, with an iridescent quality that shifted with each movement. Her eyes were completely silver with no visible pupils, yet Marcus felt the weight of her gaze like a physical force. "Dr. Marcus Quinn," she said, her voice resonant with harmonics that human vocal cords could never produce. I am Countess Vexillia of the 7th House of Astria. Her lips curved in what might have been a smile on a human face. And you, fortunately for both of us, are exactly what I've been searching for. I've been kidnapped, Marcus stated flatly, his initial fear now giving way to indignation. 1 week in the Countess's palatial vessel had taught him many things, but clarity about his purpose wasn't among them. I demand to know why. The laboratory he had been given access to was beyond anything humanity possessed. Instruments that seemed to anticipate his thoughts, materials that defied Earth classifications, and a database of xenobiological information that would have made his colleagues weep with envy. Yet it was a gilded cage nonetheless. Countess Vexillia reclined on a crystalline divan, observing him with those unsettling silver eyes. Today, her skin seemed duller, the iridescence less vibrant, the blue deepening toward gray at her temples. You are a scientist, Dr. Quinn. Surely you've formed theories. Her voice carried a hint of strain that hadn't been present during their first meeting. You're studying human physiology, but not for academic reasons. Marcus gestured to the samples he'd been asked to analyze, all human, all male, all with certain genetic markers highlighted. This is personal research. Vexillia's long fingers traced patterns in the air, and the room's illumination dimmed. In the softer light, Marcus could see more clearly the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the slight loosening of once perfect skin along her jawline. My kind isn't immortal, Dr. Quinn, merely very long-lived. 3 centuries for an Astrian is like 30 years for a human. She stood, moving with a dancer's grace despite her apparent fatigue. But even we face entropy eventually. And humans factor into this how, exactly? Her laugh was musical but brittle. Your species carries a rather remarkable trait, a biological catalyst, something in your hormonal composition, perhaps in the neurochemical responses unique to human males, that can, under the right circumstances, reactivate my cellular regeneration processes. Marcus felt a chill creep up his spine. Under the right circumstances, he repeated slowly. Is that why there are no other men aboard this ship? What happened to them? The silence stretched between them until Jadon, ever present in the shadows, shifted uncomfortably. They were incompatible, Vexillia finally said, her voice devoid of emotion. Their essences burned too quickly, their bodies rejected the symbiosis. They died, Marcus translated, horror dawning. How many? 17 over 3 centuries, she replied, not meeting his gaze. The most recent lasted nearly 5 years. Marcus felt sick, and now it's my turn to be drained until there's nothing left. No, the vehemence in her voice startled them both. Vexillia composed herself, continuing more softly. No. That's why you're here, Dr. Quinn. Your genetic profile suggests a far stronger compatibility than any before, and your scientific expertise gives us a chance to understand why, to make the process sustainable, perhaps even mutually beneficial. Marcus glanced at the laboratory equipment with new understanding. He wasn't just a test subject, he was being asked to solve his own exploitation. Show me everything, he said after a long pause. Records of the previous men, detailed data on the rejuvenation process, and your own genetic sequencing. His jaw tightened. If I'm going to be a participant in this research, I'll be leading it. Vexillia's tension visibly eased. You'll help me. I'll help us both, Marcus clarified, starting with ensuring I don't end up like your previous donors. In the shadows of the Astrian court, Lord Krypton reviewed the intelligence reports with growing interest. The Countess's sudden withdrawal from court functions, her secretive acquisition of yet another human male, the unusual profile of this particular specimen, all pointed to a growing desperation. How severe is her condition? He asked his spy, a slender Astrian with chameleon-like abilities who served on Vexillia's household staff. The deterioration accelerates daily, my lord. She increases her cosmetic modifications before any public appearance, but in private. The spy hesitated. In private, she shows signs of advanced age progression. Another month without successful rejuvenation, and it will be impossible to conceal. Krypton smiled, sharp teeth gleaming in the dim light of his chambers. After centuries in Vexillia's shadow, always the second most powerful house in the assemblage, always denied the prime counselor position that should have been his. And this human, what makes him different from the others? He's not just a compatible donor. He's actively researching the process with the Countess's full cooperation. She has given him unprecedented access to her medical data. Krypton's eyes narrowed. She's growing careless. The laws are clear. Humans are not to be given knowledge of Astrian biological vulnerabilities. Would you like me to report her violations to the Regulatory Council, my lord? Not yet, Krypton steepled his long fingers. For now, we observe. If she succeeds with this human, we must know how. If she fails, his lips curled into a cold smile. Then I shall personally escort her to the retirement colonies, as is proper for Astrians who have reached the end of their vitality. Marcus stared at the holographic display, months of research finally coalescing into understanding. It's not just biological, he murmured, more to himself than to the Countess, who stood anxiously nearby. It's bioenergetic quantum entanglement between compatible nervous systems. Explain, Vexillia demanded, moving closer. In the weeks they'd worked together, her condition had deteriorated further. The once regal Countess now moved with a slight stoop, her skin dulled to a matte gray-blue, her voice occasionally cracking like that of an elderly human. Your previous treatments worked temporarily because they were extracting a resource, not establishing a connection. Marcus highlighted a neural pathway on the display. Human males produce certain neurochemicals during states of physiological arousal and emotional bonding. Your physiology somehow evolved to harness these as catalysts for cellular rejuvenation. So the process requires intimacy, Marcus confirmed, meeting her silver eyes directly for the first time. Not just physical, but emotional. The stronger the bond, the more effective and lasting the rejuvenation. Vexillia's expression shifted through surprise, disbelief, and finally, a reluctant acceptance. That explains why the effect diminished over time with the others, she said quietly. After initial intimacy, I kept them as resources. There was no deepening connection. Exactly, you were treating the symptoms, not the cause, Marcus hesitated. We need to try a new approach, one based on mutual exchange rather than extraction. The Countess studied him, vulnerability visible beneath her regal bearing. You're suggesting we attempt a genuine connection after I abducted you, after you learned what happened to your predecessors? Marcus couldn't quite explain it to himself, let alone to her. Perhaps it was Stockholm Syndrome, or scientific curiosity, or simply the strange, undeniable pull he'd felt toward this alien being since their first meeting. I'm suggesting we have little choice, he said carefully. You need this, and I... He glanced down at the biomonitor on his wrist, showing the subtle changes already occurring in his own physiology from proximity to her. I'm already part of the process. We might as well make it work for both of us. Vexillia stepped forward, her cool hand tentatively touching his cheek. And if it fails, if you begin to decline as the others did, then I die knowing I tried something no human scientist has ever attempted. He gave her a wry smile. Besides, I've learned enough about your physiology to make some educated guesses about how to protect myself. The Countess's silver eyes searched his face for a long moment. Then, with a deliberateness that spoke of both royal authority and personal vulnerability, she leaned forward and pressed her cool lips to his. The jolt that passed between them was like nothing Marcus had ever experienced. Not simply desire, but a crackling energy that seemed to connect them at some fundamental level. When they parted, both gasping, he saw with astonishment that a faint blue luminescence had returned to Vexillia's skin where his hands had touched her shoulders. It's working, she whispered, wonder replacing the fear in her voice. You are the one. The first full rejuvenation ritual left them both transformed. Marcus lay beside the Countess in her private chamber, his body humming with residual energy, watching in fascination as the blue luminescence spread beneath her skin like watercolor blooming on wet paper. The cellular regeneration is remarkable, he murmured, the scientist in him still observing despite the intimacy they just shared. I can almost see the telomeres extending. Vexillia laughed, a sound of genuine delight that he'd never heard from her before. She rolled toward him, her silver eyes now bright with renewed vitality. The fine lines that had marred her face completely vanished. Is that what humans think about after lovemaking? Telomeres. She traced a finger along his collarbone, leaving a trail of tingling sensation. Your mind truly never stops working, does it? Professional hazard, Marcus smiled, but his expression grew more serious. How do you feel? Younger than I have in decades. She stretched luxuriously, the sheet sliding away to reveal the smooth curve of her hip. The effect is more profound than with any previous catalyst, any previous consort, she corrected herself, acknowledging the new nature of their relationship. Marcus nodded, checking the biomonitor on his wrist. And I'm showing minimal depletion. If anything, my cellular activity has increased slightly. He looked at her with cautious optimism. It seems the mutual exchange theory was correct. This isn't a zero-sum process. Vexillia propped herself up on one elbow, studying him with newfound respect. You've accomplished in weeks what our best xenobiologists couldn't solve in centuries. I had better motivation, he replied dryly. Her expression sobered. You're still a prisoner, aren't you, despite, she gestured between them, and this. Marcus considered the question carefully. I'm a scientist presented with the most extraordinary research opportunity in human history, and I'm apparently the key to keeping a 300-year-old alien countess looking youthful and radiant. His lips quirked. It's complicated. Vexillia's laughter faded as a chime sounded throughout the chamber. She sighed, the weight of her position settling back onto her shoulders. The assemblage preparation begins today. 48 representatives from the noble houses will be arriving over the next week. And they can't know about me, Marcus guessed. They know I have a human consort. That's not unusual among our kind. What they cannot know is why. She rose from the bed, her naked form gleaming in the chamber's soft light. The noble houses maintain power through the illusion of natural superiority. If it became known that we require humans not just for pleasure but for survival, she shook her head, it would destabilize the entire political structure. Marcus watched as she moved to a panel in the wall, which dissolved at her touch to reveal an elaborate wardrobe. So I'm to be hidden away during this assemblage. On the contrary, she replied, selecting a robe that shifted colors like oil on water. You'll be presented as my official consort, hidden in plain sight. The following days were a whirlwind of activity as the Countess's vessel docked at the massive Astrian capital station. Marcus found himself thrust into a crash course on Astrian political etiquette, dynastic histories, and social protocols. Remember, maintain eye contact with nobles for precisely 3 seconds, then look down, Jadon instructed as he fitted Marcus with formal attire, a suit of material that seemed to absorb and refract light in mesmerizing patterns. Any longer is a challenge, any shorter suggests guilt. 3 seconds, then down, Marcus repeated, struggling to remember the dozens of rules he'd been given. And I never speak unless directly addressed by the Countess. Correct, humans who appear too intelligent make the noble houses uncomfortable. Jadon adjusted the collar of Marcus's suit, his bony fingers surprisingly gentle. The Countess is taking an enormous risk by bringing you into the assemblage. Marcus met the advisor's obsidian eyes. Why is she doing it, then? Wouldn't it be safer to hide me? Perhaps once, Jadon said thoughtfully, but now she wishes to keep you close, for protection as much as proximity. He straightened, his formal demeanor returning. The rejuvenation has been remarkably successful. Already there are whispers about her restored vitality. Marcus frowned. Is that unusual? It has been many cycles since any of the ancient nobles showed such dramatic renewal. Jadon's voice lowered. You must understand, Dr. Quinn, you are not merely a scientific curiosity or even a rejuvenation catalyst now. You are a strategic asset that others would kill to possess or destroy. The grand concourse of the Astrian capital blazed with bioluminescent light as noble houses made their formal entrances. Marcus stood half a step behind the Countess, carefully maintaining the proper posture of a human consort, attentive but deferential, present but invisible. Vexillia moved with renewed confidence, her restored youth drawing both admiring and suspicious glances from the assembled nobility. Her hand occasionally brushed against Marcus's, a subtle gesture that sent small jolts of energy between them, maintaining her glow. Countess Vexillia, came a silky voice from their left. How remarkably refreshed you appear. Marcus recognized Lord Krypton from the briefing materials, the Countess's chief rival, and leader of the only house that could challenge hers for dominance in the assemblage. Lord Krypton, Vexillia acknowledged with the precise degree of inclination protocol demanded. The benefits of proper self-care. Krypton's gaze slid to Marcus, assessment in his reptilian eyes. And this must be your new, Diversion, human, aren't you? They all look so similar to me. Marcus bowed his head exactly as instructed, though every instinct screamed danger. Dr. Marcus Quinn, Vexillia supplied smoothly. A xenobiologist of some distinction, I find his insights on interspecies compatibility stimulating. The double meaning was clear, and several nearby nobles tittered appreciatively. But Krypton's expression remained calculating. How unusual to select a specimen of actual intelligence, he remarked. Most prefer humans for their more primitive attributes. My tastes have always been refined, Lord Krypton. Vexillia's voice cooled several degrees. Now, if you'll excuse us, there are many to greet before the formal proceedings. As they moved away, Marcus felt the weight of Krypton's stare boring into his back. He knows something, he murmured, barely moving his lips. He suspects, Vexillia corrected, her smile never faltering as she nodded to other nobles. But suspicion without proof is merely gossip, and gossip we can manage. Marcus wasn't so sure. The predatory assessment in Krypton's eyes had reminded him of a fundamental truth he'd begun to forget in Vexillia's embrace. In this world, he was not a person. He was a resource, a catalyst, and now potentially a weakness to be exploited. Later that night, as they lay in the sumptuous quarters assigned to the 7th house, Marcus voiced his concerns. Krypton will be watching me, watching us. Vexillia traced patterns on his chest, small sparks of blue energy following her fingertips. Since their discovery of the true nature of their bond, they'd found that even such casual contact helped maintain her rejuvenation. Let him watch, she said dismissively. The assemblage lasts only 15 days. Once I secure the Prime Counselor position, we'll return to my vessel and continue our research in privacy. Marcus caught her hand, stilling her movement. And then what, Vexillia? What happens when you've learned all you can from me, when you've mapped every aspect of this process? The question hung between them, laden with implications neither had fully addressed. In the weeks since their first intimate connection, something had shifted between them, something that transcended scientific curiosity or mutual necessity. Vexillia's silver eyes shimmered in the dim light. I don't know, she admitted, a rare vulnerability in her voice. 3 centuries of experience, and I find myself in entirely uncharted territory. She leaned down, pressing her forehead to his in an Astrian gesture of deep trust. All I know is that I no longer think of you as merely my catalyst. You have become, she searched for the word, essential. The kiss that followed sealed a promise neither could fully articulate, one that would be tested sooner than either imagined. On the 8th day of the assemblage, Marcus disappeared. Vexillia felt his absence immediately, a hollow sensation beneath her breastbone, as if a vital organ had been removed. The quantum entanglement between them, strengthened by repeated intimacy, had created a bond that transcended mere physical proximity. She knew with absolute certainty that he was no longer on the station. Find him, she commanded Jadon, her voice deadly calm despite the panic clawing at her insides. Deploy every resource, activate every informant. I want to know who took him and where. Jadon bowed deeply. The assemblage voting begins in 6 hours, my Countess. Protocol demands your presence. Protocol be damned. The crystal decanter on her desk shattered at her outburst, sending shards flying across the room. She took a deep breath, forcing control back into her voice. Find him, Jadon, or the next Prime Counselor will be selecting a new head of House 7. As her advisor hurried away, Vexillia moved to the window overlooking the vast Astrian capital. Already, she could feel it beginning, the subtle deterioration that Marcus's presence had held at bay. Without the regular exchange of their unique bioenergy, the rejuvenation would begin to reverse within days. But that was not why her hands trembled as she gripped the windowsill. I care for him, she realized with a shock that was almost physical. Not as a scientific curiosity, not as a rejuvenation source, but as Marcus. The brilliant mind, the dry humor, the unwavering ethical core that had somehow survived captivity and exploitation to forge something genuine between them. For the first time in centuries, Countess Vexillia was afraid, not for her position or her youth, but for someone else. Marcus awakened in darkness, his head throbbing where the neural stunner had struck him. He'd been returning from the station's xenobiology library, arms full of research materials, when the attack came, swift, professional, and completely unexpected. "The human is conscious," announced a voice in Astrian, not realizing Marcus had learned enough of the language to understand. A panel slid open, flooding the small chamber with harsh light. Marcus squinted against the glare, making out the tall, imposing silhouette of Lord Krypton. "Dr. Quinn," the Astrian noble said smoothly, switching to flawless English, "I apologize for the abrupt nature of our invitation." "Kidnapping," Marcus corrected, struggling to sit up despite the restraints around his wrists and ankles. "You seem fond of the practice in your culture." Krypton's lips curved in what might have been amusement. "A cultural misunderstanding. We merely wish to speak with you privately away from Countess Vexilia's influence." "Then speak." The Astrian moved further into the room, his movements predatory and fluid. "You are an intelligent specimen, Dr. Quinn. You must have realized by now that you are simply the latest in a long line of human males used by the Countess for rejuvenation." Marcus kept his expression neutral, revealing nothing. "What you may not realize," Krypton continued, "is that such usage violates our highest laws. The Genetic Sovereignty Act prohibits any noble from becoming dependent on another species for survival. It is considered undignified." "Is that why you've taken me, to press charges against the Countess?" Krypton laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh no, Dr. Quinn, I've taken you to offer you a choice." He seated himself on a floating chair that materialized from the floor. "You see, the Countess's dependency creates an opportunity. If she fails to appear at today's voting, or worse, appears in a state of visible deterioration, her house's claim to the prime counselor position collapses." "And yours rises," Marcus concluded. "Precisely." Krypton leaned forward. "Here is my offer. Provide me with a full explanation of the rejuvenation process, all your research, all your findings, and I will return you to Earth with wealth beyond your imagination." "And the Countess will face the natural consequences of her dependency." Krypton's voice hardened. "She has cheated time for too long, Dr. Quinn. 3 centuries is an obscene extension, even by our standards." Marcus considered his options. He was clearly aboard a different vessel, likely in orbit around the station. Escape was impossible, and yet— "You've miscalculated, Lord Krypton," he said quietly. "You assume I want to return to Earth. You assume I'm being held against my will. Are you claiming your affection for the Countess is genuine?" Krypton's tone dripped with skepticism. "A Stockholm syndrome fascinating to xenopsychologists, perhaps, but hardly credible." "What I feel for the Countess is complex," Marcus replied, choosing his words carefully. "But I know with absolute certainty that I won't help you destroy her." Krypton's expression darkened. "Then perhaps we should test the limits of this remarkable bond you share." He gestured, and a door slid open to reveal an array of instruments that, while unfamiliar to Marcus, clearly had painful purposes. "You see, I'm curious. If you suffer, will she feel it? Our intelligence suggests the quantum entanglement works both ways." Fear coiled in Marcus's stomach, but he kept his voice steady. "You won't kill me. I'm too valuable as a research subject." "Kill, no." Krypton selected a slender, crystalline device from the array. "But there are many thresholds between comfort and death, Dr. Quinn. Shall we explore them together?" The Countess was halfway through her formal address to the assemblage when she felt it, a white-hot lance of pain shooting through her body. She faltered mid-sentence, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the podium. "Marcus." She could feel his agony through their connection, sense his determination not to break despite whatever torture Krypton was inflicting. And beneath it all, a current of emotion directed toward her, concern, affection, and something deeper that neither of them had dared name. The assembled noble houses murmured as she struggled to regain her composure. In the third row, Lord Krypton's seat remained conspicuously empty. "Countess," prompted the assemblage speaker, "your position on the Colonial Expansion Treaty." Vexilia straightened, a decision crystallizing in her mind. For 3 centuries, she had played the game of Astrian politics, had compromised, manipulated, and sacrificed to maintain her position. She had treated humans as resources, had hidden her dependency behind closed doors. "No more." "Before I continue," she announced, her voice ringing across the chamber, "I must address a matter of grave importance. Lord Krypton of House 3 has abducted my human consort, Dr. Marcus Quinn." The chamber erupted in shocked whispers. The speaker banged his ceremonial staff for order. These are serious allegations, Countess. What evidence do you present? Vexillia stepped from behind the podium, moving to the center of the speaking floor. I present myself as evidence. With deliberate movements, she removed the ornate collar that symbolized her house's status. I, Countess Vexillia of the 7th House of Astria, formally acknowledge before the assemblage that I have developed a quantum biological bond with my human consort. Gasps echoed through the chamber. Such an admission was unprecedented, tantamount to political suicide. This bond, she continued, her voice unwavering, has become the foundation of my cellular rejuvenation. Without it, I will begin to age at an accelerated rate. She raised her chin, pride evident in every line of her body. Lord Krypton has taken Dr. Quinn to force my deterioration before the Prime Councillor vote. The speaker's expression was grave. If what you say is true, Countess, you have violated the Genetic Sovereignty Act. The penalty is irrelevant at this moment, Vexillia interrupted. A citizen of Earth under my protection is being tortured as we speak. I can feel it through our connection. She turned a full circle, addressing the entire assemblage. I ask you no. I demand that this body recognize the fundamental violation of interspecies diplomatic protocols that Lord Krypton has committed. Whatever my crimes, Dr. Quinn is innocent. A moment of stunned silence followed her declaration. Then, from the back of the chamber, a voice spoke. House 22 recognizes the primacy of interspecies diplomatic law over internal matters of succession. Another voice joined. House 15 concurs, the human must be recovered. Within moments, a cascade of support followed, not for Vexillia personally, but for the principle she had invoked. The Astrian nobility prided themselves on their adherence to diplomatic protocols with other spacefaring species. Krypton's action threatened not just Vexillia's position, but the standing of all Astrians in interstellar relations. The speaker raised his staff. By consensus of the assemblage, an immediate location and retrieval operation is authorized. He fixed Vexillia with a stern gaze. Your own violations will be addressed afterward, Countess. Vexillia bowed her head in acknowledgement. I ask only to participate in the retrieval. I can sense Dr. Quinn's location through our bond. As the assemblage disbanded to organize the operation, Jadon materialized at her side. You have sacrificed everything, he whispered, disbelief evident in his voice. 3 centuries of power gone in an instant. Vexillia watched as the noble houses hurried to dispatch their security forces, unified momentarily in defense of a principle greater than their individual ambitions. Not everything, she replied softly, her hand pressed to her chest where the connection to Marcus pulsed like a second heartbeat. Not the most important thing. Marcus had lost track of time in the haze of pain. Krypton's instruments were designed for precision, maximizing neural feedback while minimizing physical damage. The Astrian had asked the same questions repeatedly. How does the rejuvenation process work? What is the exact mechanism of transfer? Could it be replicated with other humans? Through it all, Marcus had remained silent on the scientific details, giving only cryptic or misleading answers when the pain became too great to bear. Your loyalty is admirable but misplaced, Krypton said, selecting yet another instrument from the array. The Countess has used and discarded 17 humans before you. What makes you think you're different? Marcus managed a pained smile, because she's never felt this before. Felt what? My pain. Marcus's voice was hoarse but triumphant. You wanted to know if the bond works both ways. It does. Every moment of this she's experiencing, and unlike you, she cares. Uncertainty flickered across Krypton's face for the first time. Impossible. The rejuvenation process is parasitic, not sympathetic. That's where you're wrong. That's why all the others failed. Marcus struggled to sit up straighter despite his restraints. It's not about taking, it's about exchange, connection, something I doubt you could understand. Krypton was about to respond when the ship's alert system blared to life. A voice echoed through the chamber. Unauthorized docking in progress, multiple vessels approaching. The Astrian noble's composure cracked. Impossible, we're cloaked. You can't hide from someone who can sense exactly where I am, Marcus said, relief washing through him. She's coming, and she's not alone. Krypton rose abruptly, moving toward the exit. This changes nothing. By the time they reach you, I'll have transmitted evidence of the Countess's violations to the Regulatory Council. Her admission of dependency will. His words cut off as the ship shuddered violently. The lights flickered, then stabilized. "Impact on Docking Bay 3, the automated voice announced. "Hull breach detected." Krypton snarled something in Astrian that Marcus's limited knowledge couldn't translate, but the sentiment was clear. The noble hurried from the room, sealing the door behind him. Alone in the chamber, Marcus closed his eyes, focusing on the thread of connection he could feel pulsing stronger with each passing moment. "I'm here," he projected, unsure if thoughts could travel along the same pathway as physical sensation. "I'm alive." The response came not as words, but as a wave of emotion. Relief, determination, and something deeper that wrapped around him like a protective shield. Minutes later, the door to his chamber disintegrated in a shower of crystalline fragments. Vexillia stood in the opening, her skin glowing with fierce intensity, surrounded by a contingent of armored Astrians bearing the insignia of multiple houses. "Marcus," his name on her lips was both a statement and a question. "I'm okay," he managed, though the evidence of Krypton's interrogation was written across his body. Vexillia crossed to him in 3 swift strides, her hands moving to release his restraints. The moment her fingers touched his skin, a visible current of energy passed between them, blue light flowing from him to her and back again in a continuous circuit. "You told them," he whispered as she helped him to his feet. "About us, about the rejuvenation." "I did," her silver eyes held his, unwavering. "Some secrets are not worth keeping, even at the cost of power." An Astrian officer stepped forward. "Countess, Lord Krypton has been detained. The assemblage demands your immediate return to face judgment regarding your violations of the Genetic Sovereignty Act." Vexillia nodded, her arm supporting Marcus as they moved toward the exit. "I will face whatever judgment they deem appropriate, after Dr. Quinn receives medical attention." As they made their way through Krypton's vessel, Marcus leaned closer to her. "What will they do to you?" "Exile, most likely, removal from the noble hierarchy, confiscation of assets." She spoke matter-of-factly, but without regret. "The retirement colonies are actually quite pleasant, I'm told." "All this for me?" The weight of her sacrifice settled on him. "Vexillia, I—" "Not for you," she corrected gently. "For us, for what we've discovered together." Her hand tightened on his. "A connection worth more than 3 centuries of political power." Marcus felt the truth of it in the energy that continued to flow between them, stronger than before despite his weakened state. Whatever came next, whatever price they both paid for defying the established order, they would face it together, human and Astrian, bound by something neither species had anticipated but both could recognize. It felt impossibly like coming home. The judgment of the assemblage was swift, but not as severe as Vexillia had feared. Stripped of her title and formal position, she retained a modest estate on the outskirts of Astrian territory, far from the politics of the capital, but not the complete exile to the retirement colonies that tradition demanded. "A compromise," explained the elder adjudicator as the sentence was delivered. "Your violation of the Genetic Sovereignty Act cannot go unpunished, but your willingness to sacrifice position for principle has," impressed certain influential members. Marcus, now fully recovered in the 2 weeks since his rescue, stood beside her in the judgment chamber. His hand found hers as they exited into the pale violet light of the Astrian moon, where her new estate was located. "So what happens now?" he asked as they watched the official transport depart, leaving them alone on the landing platform of what would be their home. "No more politics, no more court intrigue." "Freedom," Vexillia replied, her silver eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Something I haven't known in 3 centuries." Inside the estate, modest by noble standards but still luxurious by human ones, they found that Jadon had already arranged their belongings. The loyal advisor had chosen to follow Vexillia into her reduced circumstances, one of the few from her household to do so. "The laboratory has been established according to your specifications, Dr. Quinn," he informed them, pointing to a wing of the building. "I took the liberty of transferring all research materials before they could be confiscated." Marcus nodded his thanks, his mind already racing with the possibilities. Free from the pressures of court politics, they could now focus entirely on understanding the unique bond they shared. That night, as they stood on the balcony overlooking a landscape of crystal formations that hummed soft harmonies in the breeze, Vexillia turned to Marcus with unusual hesitation. "I've had a thought," she began, her fingers tracing the now familiar patterns of energy between them. "Our research has shown that each rejuvenation strengthens our quantum entanglement." "Yes," Marcus agreed. "The cellular harmonization increases by approximately 12% with each exchange." "What if," she paused, seeming to gather courage, "what if we took it further, a complete synchronization of our bioenergetic fields?" Marcus's eyes widened as he understood. "You're talking about making the bond permanent, irreversible." "It would mean sharing my lifespan with you," she said softly, "and me sharing your humanity, neither fully Astrian nor human, but something new." The implications were staggering. Centuries of life for him, a fundamental alteration of identity for her. A true marriage of species that went beyond the physical or even the emotional. There would be risks, he cautioned, the scientist in him automatically cataloging the unknowns. "Many," she agreed, "but there is one certainty." Her silver eyes held his. "I do not wish to live those centuries without you, not anymore." Marcus took her hands in his, feeling the now familiar current of energy that passed between them. The tangible manifestation of something that had grown far beyond its origins as captive and captor, specimen and researcher. "When I was in Krypton's ship," he said slowly, "there was a moment when I thought I might die, and my only regret was the possibility of never seeing you again." He lifted her hand to his lips. "I don't need centuries to know what I want, Vexillia, just you." Their kiss sealed a decision that would change not just their lives, but potentially the relationship between their species forever. As their energies mingled more deeply than ever before, the boundaries between them, human and Astrian, mortal and long-lived, began to blur into something entirely new. 2 years later, the first diplomatic delegation from Earth arrived at the estate. They had come seeking knowledge of Astrian biotechnology, authorized by both governments to establish formal scientific exchange protocols. What they found was more than they had bargained for. A human scientist whose cellular structure had been partially transformed, extending his natural lifespan tenfold, and an Astrian noble who had gained human emotional capabilities previously unknown to her species. "It's not about exploitation," Marcus explained to the wide-eyed human delegates as they toured the laboratory where he and Vexillia continued their research. "It's about symbiosis, connection, finding the places where our differences become strengths rather than barriers." Vexillia, watching from across the room, felt a surge of pride. The fallen Countess and the kidnapped scientist had created something revolutionary, a template for true interspecies harmony that went beyond political alliances or commercial arrangements. That night, as reports of their breakthrough spread throughout both human and Astrian communication networks, Marcus and Vexillia stood again on their balcony, watching twin moons rise over the crystal plains. "Do you ever miss it?" Marcus asked. "The power, the position, the centuries of accumulated influence." Vexillia considered the question, her fingers intertwined with his, silver eyes reflecting starlight. "I had 300 years of that life, and I was alone in every moment that mattered." She turned to face him, her transformed biology allowing her to smile in the human way that still felt new and wonderful. "I would trade 1,000 years of power for one lifetime of this." As they sealed this truth with a kiss, the energy that had once been merely a rejuvenation mechanism flowed between them, no longer just preserving life but enriching it, no longer just connecting bodies but souls. In finding each other, they had created something eternal that transcended the limitations of both their species. It was, they both knew, only the beginning.